Hello, and welcome to Ipsy Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. My name is Guy Hamilton Smith, and I am the legal fellow for the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center at the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law. On the show today, I'll be speaking with Professor Aya Gruber, who is a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School and the author of the forthcoming book, The Feminist War on Crime, The Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration. It will be officially released in June, but I am told that if you order it online, it's actually shipping now, and there will be a Kindle edition that is available May 1st. Aya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I was really thrilled to finally get a chance to connect with you and to read your book, which I found to be just a timely and compelling and necessary work, especially at this particular juncture in our culture. We are kind of living in an era of not just Me Too, but also coronavirus. And there's just, I think, a lot that we can, that your work speaks to as far as what's going on in our culture right now, how we got here, and, sort of where we go from here. But to start, I was wondering if you could, just sort of unpack a little bit about what brought you to, focusing on this work, on examining the role of, women's liberation and, contributing to mass incarceration.
Well, I think my interest in both feminism and mass incarceration goes way back to before law school, but I think it's probably wise to begin my story there, and this is where the book begins its story. When I was in law school, I knew that I wanted to be a public defender. It had been something that I had been thinking about since basically junior high school. And I interned when I was 14 at the Public Defender Service. And I remember one day going to a juvenile detention center where there was a young girl my age charged with first-degree murder as an accomplice for something that her boyfriend did. And we talked and we looked at each other and we looked very similar, and it just really struck me. So I had always thought that I wanted to represent indigent people against the awesome power of the state. But at the same time, I had this nagging dread as a feminist of defending batterers and rapists. That is something that I also from, undergrad and even before that had been drilled into my mind that as somebody who cares about the rights of women, the foremost thing we should care about is sexual violence. And sexual violence is a matter of not just bad men, but also patriarchal culture. So I was really in what I call a feminist defense attorney dilemma. I knew that jails were this site of racial degradation and just something that I thought that was intolerable in a civilized society. But at the same time, my feminist side said, we really have to be tough on these horrible sexist men. So that's the kind of dilemma I felt in before I started practicing as a public defender. And then when I started practicing, I saw that everything was more complicated than I had imagined. I'm going on, but for example, domestic violence court. So I was a public defender at the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. And D.C., I believe, second to Miami-Dade County, where actually I was an intern because I'm from Miami, had the second specialized domestic violence court. And that's where I practiced day after day. And day after day, I saw prosecutors proceed with cases against women's wishes. I saw judges uphold stay away orders when victims themselves were saying, no, I want to keep my family intact. I saw immigrant women lamenting that their call to the police for help in a particular dispute uh, triggered an unstoppable carceral machine that made their partners jailable and deportable. So I saw all this going on, and my dilemma really did resolve. I had believed going into practice that protecting women and fighting against violence were unconditional goods. But when I started practicing, I saw that the model of prosecution as the solution to women's inequality really had far more costs than benefits. So when I eventually became a law professor, I wrote about a lot of different things, but this dilemma and my resolution of it stuck in my mind. So from early on in my career as a law professor, I kind of just discussed this dilemma and how I resolved it. I discussed the fact that it seemed like, prosecution was the panacea, but it really wasn't. But like one thing I never did in any of my articles, up until this book, was really go back in time and figure out how prosecution and the feminist anti-violence agenda became inseparable.
Mm-hmm. And so in your book is sort of, as we were discussing, a little bit earlier before the show, that your book is sort of broken up into two segments, or two different, as you call them, stories. One being a domestic violence piece, and one being a sexual assault piece. And in this era of coronavirus, I mean, one of the things that I think is on a lot of people's minds is, how do we address domestic violence now when many states are under quarantine or stay-at-home orders, and but domestic violence is obviously something that is not doesn't go away, because we're all just quarantined inside our homes. In some ways, it makes domestic violence potentially more of a pressing threat. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of your thoughts about how we can how we can approach thinking about domestic violence in both this modern era, and then I also have some follow-up questions for you, just about how we kind of got to our present stance on domestic violence, that I found to be really interesting in reading your book. But I'll ask that here in a bit.
Well, no, I think it's a great question because both are related. I think, we have to go back to see the missed opportunities about how to think about violence against women in a non-carceral way, and how we sort of veered towards the arrest and prosecute direction in order to, solve some of the pressing contemporary problems. So I'll start with the pressing contemporary problem. It seems, although there is some conflicting evidence on this, that domestic violence is either increasing during the COVID lockdown, or at least it's not decreasing at the level that other crimes are just, crime rates are plummeting, which is one of the great effects of sort of everything that's going on right now. Amongst all the misery, that's one bright piece of news. But it doesn't seem to be the case for domestic violence. And that makes sense, according to the social science. Social scientists have always connected domestic violence up to social and family stressors. So social stressors are like economic inequality, racism, job stress. All these kinds of stresses lead to violence in the home, or at least exacerbate it. And then there are family stressors. That can be money issues, problems with children, other kinds of marital strife, division of labor. So when you think about the lockdown and the economic problems and the worries over COVID, stress is running high, and this can be a predicate for domestic violence. One of the things I think is like so refreshing about the current era is you do see a lot of coverage of the epidemic of domestic violence. And a lot of it hints that the solution is sort of, taking the men into custody. But I think anecdotally, I noticed far fewer calls for really cracking down in a carceral way on domestic violence, so much as sort of talking about resources for the women who may be, or men who may be in this situation. So that is refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this, to the extent that we think that we've got to arrest them all, that's become an almost automatic response. Oh, a guy's an abuser. What he deserves is to be thrown the book at. He should be abused like he abuses women. So that is the kind of knee-jerk reaction. And right now, that knee-jerk reaction is really not a great reaction, because what you'll have is a few hours to a few days in jail. And then you have this revolving door of COVID that's just going to make the victims worse off. So what I want to do through my book is untether feminists' very important concerns about combating violence against women from this arrest, prosecute, and incarcerate phenomenon. So I want to untether feminism from mass incarceration. And so I think understanding how we got to this almost automatic connection of domestic violence and arrest and prosecute is really important if we're going to move away from that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that you do a really excellent and thorough job in your book of exploring the historical foundations for how we got here, the uneasy alliances that were often made between some feminist, radical feminist, shelter advocates who you talk about, that they would needed to accept, funding on from the state in order to operate. But of course, a condition of that funding meant that they were then more or less like an arm of the state, almost. And so I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about how, the background to how we got here, and some of those uneasy alliances that led us to this stance that we have now of, as you say, it's sort of a reflex, it arrests them all, no drop prosecutions, those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And it's a long and fascinating and complicated story of feminist engagement with the state, even as they reject the state, feminists exacerbating certain social hierarchies, even as they produce justice for individual women. There's just such a rich story there. And I want to make clear that I am not judging the feminists who made the choices to go with criminal law as somehow bad or misguided or power hungry or anything like that. They made hard strategic and philosophical choices with the information they were given. But I think a critical understanding of going back in this time and seeing how it all fleshed out can point us in better directions for the future. So let me sort of break the story down into sort of two historical moments. And one, the initial historical moment, is what I call a clash between anti-poverty feminists and anti-patriarchy feminists. And then the second historical moment is a clash between sort of all the anti-state or radical feminists and, in my book, what I call legal feminists, or sometimes I call them enforcement feminists. And I think one of the historical periods sort of set the stage for the second historical period. So when you look at the birth of the modern battered women's movement, which is really roughly the same as the birth of second wave feminism, coming in the late 60s and early 70s, it was really radical and anti-authoritarian at its core. So what you had was a group of what I'm calling in the book shelter feminists, people who imagined nothing less than these alternative, egalitarian, women-only societies, free from the Vietnam warmongering state and, police busting protesters police state. And they really wanted to imagine that they could run shelters free of bureaucratic, warmongering, dirty money. Now, of course, that couldn't happen because shelter feminists needed funding for the shelters, and they did end up finding themselves in this unending, painful compromise of either going to these private capitalist organizations or the state bureaucracy. But nonetheless, their philosophy was definitely anti-carceral in the core. They were very skeptical of using the authoritarian mechanisms of the state. And then you also had these anti-poverty feminists. For example, welfare rights activists like the Black feminist Johnny Tillman. And they believed that the key to protecting women from violence was to give women money, that they were driven into the arms of the abusers, or they faced an abusive welfare state, welfare apparatus, who, for example, would send in agents to study every aspect of the women's house to make sure there was no man there because the man meant money, right? So this broken welfare system that was basically torturing recipients was also a big cause. But then there was a third category of feminists. They sort of weren't either radical shelter feminists or anti-poverty feminists, but anti-patriarchy feminists. And one of the most famous of them was a lesbian activist named Del Martin, and she wrote the book on domestic violence. And for them, domestic violence was primarily a matter of patriarchal and sexist marital norms in society. So they were really using domestic violence as a hook to say the entire marital and romantic relation between men and women is broken, and exhibit A is domestic violence. So there were these really different philosophies here. And there was a clash between feminists of color and anti-patriarchy feminists in these very famous 1978 Commission on Civil Rights hearings. So basically, the welfare / feminists of color came up and said, you know what the problem is here with domestic violence? It's racism. It's racism that causes a lot of men of color to engage in compensatory subordination. And that leaves women of color without any money. And it's also economic. These women, they need childcare. They need well-paying jobs. They need health care, right? So that's what the women of color were coming up and saying. And the anti-patriarchy feminists were a little dismayed by this. So powerful voices within that movement, judges who were pioneers, women who were the first in their law classes came up and said, no, battering isn't a matter of economics and racism. Battering is a matter of patriarchy and sexist individual men. It crosses all economic lines. It crosses all social class lines. It's the same in an upper class neighborhood in Maryland as in an inner city in Detroit. And so what we need to understand was in order to stop domestic violence, it doesn't have to do with money. It has to do with ending sexist marital norms and fighting against the patriarchy. So that was the initial fight. And it is very clear to me that the anti-patriarchy feminists won. The mantra that domestic violence is the same in a poor neighborhood, is the same in a Black neighborhood, is the same in a rich neighborhood, and is the same in a white neighborhood. What expert Beth Ritchie has called the, quote, every woman narrative, really did win the day. So that was the first battle, and anti-patriarchy feminists won it.
Right. And you talk about this in the book in terms of almost a crime logic that began to be espoused and adopted by feminist movements as the way that we think about not just domestic violence, but sexual violence and gendered violence, in general. And involved in that, I think that you also talk a little bit in the book about sort of the construction of ideal victims, being the I guess the as you just said, the every woman philosophy that sort of won the day. And I know that we've been talking, of course, about domestic violence, but as mentioned earlier, there's a second story here, and that's about sexual violence. And so, do you see that? Do you think that the same missed opportunities for, I guess, illuminating structural forces at play operate in the field of sexual violence in the same vein, in the same manner that happened with domestic violence as well?
Absolutely. And I think that's the second part of the story in domestic violence, because even if you say, all right, the problem is patriarchy, well, then you would think what you would work on were the patriarchal norms and distributions that keep women locked in brutal marriages or make women vulnerable to sexual abuse. But instead, it seems like all of feminism turned to this carceral model. And there was a specific reason why. There were a group in the 1970s of feminists and civil rights lawyers who worked in court, and they saw a specific subset of battered women. It's women who had been pretty brutally abused and had already resolved to leave batterers, but faced a lot of opposition from police and courts. And so what ended up happening were these class action lawsuits that purported to speak for all battered women, but really were based on a certain subset of battered women who really did want to separate and really did want police aid in arresting the batterers. And this group eventually spoke not just for all battered women, but also for the entire world of options to reduce battering. So at the same time on the table was the idea that we could maybe reframe the intervention to battering as a mediation, as resources, as violence interruption, but not necessarily as arrest and prosecution. Well, these class action lawsuits pretty much took that off the table. In what became the preferred remedy was arrest and the criminal system, even though a lot of the criminologists and sociologists at the time were saying, hold up, we are pretty sure that this is just going to increase the level of social stress in these families and in these communities. But the focus quickly became this adversarial criminal trial model. And the interesting thing is that the same thing happened with rape. So around the same time as we were having this battered women's movement, we were also having the second wave feminist movement, which was in no small part a response to sexual liberation and trying to figure out, what does rape mean now that people are allowed to have, non-marital sex and fornication and we have free love. Now we have to figure out, we have this old puritanical moral order crumbling, and we've got to figure out kind of how people are supposed to have sex in this newly liberated world. And so what you see in the rape space is, rape debates, moving less from this idea of stranger rape or the ruination of a woman as marital property because she's been raped, and sort of rape as this life-ruining offense because it de-virginizes women, to rape as sort of a crime of autonomy. In other words, you have gone past the boundaries of what's acceptable in a dating sexual scenario, right? So the idea of date rape became the frame. But that frame of date rape was just put on top of a scaffolding built by the rape laws of old, which were extremely, high penaltied and extremely moralistic. So then we have date rape sort of put in to the category of these first degree 20-year life offense rapes. And then the next battle became how to figure out how to get these date rapes prosecuted and how to figure out how the jury, how to get the juries to convict enough. So like domestic violence, this whole question of figuring out the bounds of sexuality in a sexually liberated era became all about prosecution and trial rules and evidence rules and how to ensure that these cases get to police and that these cases get to prosecutors.
Mm.
So again, we see the criminal model ascending.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you do a really excellent job in your book of unpacking, not just as you mentioned, rules of evidence that changed and shifted, but one thing that I was hoping that you could unpack a little bit, because I know that there's been, at least I guess relatively recently, it's been in the news a bit, is this idea of affirmative consent, and what that means, and what you kind of see as some of its implications, or the problems that it poses for when we're trying to graft it onto this criminal model.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that affirmative consent poses, and I've written about this more in articles than I would say the book, is that people seem to have their own idea of what it means at any given time. So it either means really a lot or really nothing, depending on who you speak to and the context under which you speak to them. So, the idea of affirmative consent is it's going to give us a lot of benefits in the trial setting, because trials can become this parade of horribles where you put the victim on trial and ask, what were you wearing? What are you like? And all this is a way to figure out whether the woman really consented in her mind. So she's getting up there and saying, I believe this was unconsensual. I believe this is a rape. The defendant's getting up there and saying, I believe this is all consensual. This was not a rape. And the jury's got to figure out, well, was this consensual? Well, if we don't have affirmative consent, if we have what I call sometimes in my writing a quote, ordinary consent standard, the jury's got to figure out, well, did she really, want to have this sex? So then you get into the parade of horribles. So the idea of affirmative consent is that, well, this gives you a determinate method. Don't concentrate on what she was thinking, concentrate on what she said or did, right? So unless it's clear that she performed some consent, this is a rape. So it doesn't matter whether the defendant believed or even reasonably believed, based on the totality of the circumstances, that it was consensual, unless she performed a yes, it was rape. And so that gives us a lot of benefits. It's determinate. It relies on communication. It supports this idea that you have to presume that people don't want to have sex with you unless they clearly communicate otherwise. So then you could say, all right, this is kind of a yes means yes standard. But then on the flip side, there are a lot of problems with a yes means yes standard. The number one problem being that is not generally how people communicate consent to sex. They communicate subtly, non-verbally, right? Through totality of the circumstance type of signaling. So a yes means yes standard makes a lot of the sex that people are currently having a pretty serious felony crime. All right, so this is the tension in affirmative consent. And the biggest problem I see is affirmative consent proponents will say, okay, it brings us all these benefits, right? But then when you say to them, yeah, but it makes a lot of the sex that people have criminal, they just, recede back into, no, it doesn't, because we count everything as affirmative consent. Subtle signals can be affirmative consent. Well, if subtle signals can be affirmative consent, then it doesn't have all the benefits, right? So,
Right.
So that's the conundrum, right? The first thing is, let's pick what we mean as affirmative consent. And if you want it to have all the benefits, then you've got to deal with the drawbacks, right? And there are major drawbacks here. But what we can't have is this sort of sliding back and forth between, it's this huge revolution in rape law or it's nothing, because that's just going to cause confusion. And what I worry about that confusion is that prosecutors, police officers are then having this affirmative consent that's on a spectrum from you can pretty much call anybody a rapist to no, we're going to look more at common sense sort of definitions of rape. And then they're going to apply that spectrum in a racially or economically biased way, where if a guy looks like a rapist, right, they get the affirmative consent, yes means yes rule. But if they look like a nice guy, they're under sort of the ordinary consent rules. And a lot of this might happen unconsciously. So I think we need to be very clear on the stakes of the affirmative consent debate. And then when we're clear on it, go ahead, be a proponent of a yes means yes version of affirmative consent, but just understand that you're going to have to defend these extremely serious and carceral drawbacks.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, so it's certainly a question that, and you don't talk about it certainly at length in the book, but just because it's an area of focus of mine, I would be remiss if I didn't ask. But, one of the areas that I focus on in my work is, of course, post-conviction sex offense registries and indefinite civil, confinement. How do you see those as like fitting into this larger, this larger apparatus of, what you might term, carceral feminism?
Well, absolutely. I think it's, all a piece. So a lot of progressive criminal law scholars have come to the point where they're seeing that these extremely draconian sex offender registration and notification laws, combined with civil commitment, combined with the exorbitant penalties for sex offenses, are really bad policy, criminogenic, marginally constitutional, and probably a human rights violation. And so we see a lot of pushback from the progressive criminal law professoriate on these laws. At the same time, right, there is this movement with Me Too and Title IX and the campus rape crisis to broaden the category of behaviors and, the number of people that can fall under the umbrella of sex offender. So that seems kind of like a tension, right? So what I've heard from, feminists who are sort of at the forefront of expanding definitions of rape and sexual assault and sexual misconduct is that, well, we want to expand the substantive definitions of rape, but we are not for these draconian rape penalties, and feminists never were for that. Okay, well, that is true in some ways and not true in others. In fact, it was feminists in the Take Back the Night movement who did push the stranger in the bushes narrative. The original feminist anti-rape movement actually wasn't about date rape. It predated that. And it was really about not just rape, but women, these very rare cases where women were sort of randomly murdered while walking home at night. So it was straight up stranger rape, violent predator narrative. And that narrative, overlapped with conservative crime control, tough on crime, anti-predator narratives during the 90s. So it really always was a confluence of feminist, anti-violence, anti-patriarchy sentiments, and these tough on crime sentiments and moralistic sentiments. Those were combined earlier. But today, I think they're still being combined, because one of the things that the Me Too movement is doing, and I think it's putting us in some very tricky situations right now, is, I mean,
Right.
we can talk about that in a second, but is this idea that every form of sexual violence is the same as another form. And I think, one of the great, so it's what Janet Halley calls collapsing the continuum. And I think it's really dangerous to collapse the continuum on sexual behavior, because sexual behavior from time immemorial, not to sound like Foucault, has been tracked down for extirpation, right? It's always been something that people already want to level up and level up and level up. So I always think there's that tendency there. But when you look at Me Too, one great thing about it is it told people, confess your victimhood. And I think that that's great in a way, as somebody who herself has been victimized sexually. I think saying, look, I'm a victim and it's not my fault and I'm not ashamed and I should
Mhm.
carry this burden and weight. That's a great part of it. But a danger in that sort of public, cathartic, revolutionary confessional is that everybody wants to be part of the solution, and empowered and not part of the problem. So what you then get is a range of confessions from really violent rapes to, somebody stared at my chest on the subway.
Mhm.
And although, somebody staring at your chest on the subway, that's not a great thing. That's uncomfortable. That's gross, right?
Right.
It's not something we want to collapse into criminal sexual assault, given the carcerality of it. And
Mhm.
I think that, one of the things about collapsing every allegation, no matter how old, no matter how fraught, no matter how few witnesses there are, no matter whether the person who's accused did it as a kid, it's all rape, it's all equal, and the person must be canceled for life, is it becomes this incredibly powerful force that we're unable to talk about in a way that we talk about all other things in our lives. So, people are really struggling with what to do about the Joe Biden allegation now.
Mhm.
You know,
Right.
where does this narrative lead us when we have an existential crisis on our hands, right? Of coronavirus and just the crazy kind of injecting bleach leadership that we have going on right now. And
Yeah.
right? And the alternative to that leadership is Joe Biden. And okay, you can have different political beliefs here. But one of the things that people are really wrestling with, especially feminists, is he's also got an allegation of sexual assault out there.
Mhm.
And what I've been
Yeah.
told, right, to be a good feminist is I have to believe it and I have to cancel him.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really has struck me in all of this is that I mean, there is a markedly different, there seems to be a markedly different response and approach depending on, at least from some corners of Me Too and some corners of the political establishment, sort of depending on the political beliefs of the person who's being accused. And in some ways, that's frustrating. I mean, if you are someone who fundamentally believes that women and men who are alleging being sexually victimized should be taken seriously, then it's frustrating to see a lot of people who would formerly agree with you and now they're not they're not taking this instance seriously. And I guess what's your impression of the I mean, why do you think that is? That there seems to be multiple standards, at least from some people, just depending on. I mean, is it just a political tool? Do you think, like Me Too, or do you think that there's, multiple strands of it? Or I guess what's your impression of this current scenario that we find ourselves in collectively?
So I do think there are multiple strands of Me Too, and I think that some are really great. I think that women standing up against sexual violence is great. I think women standing up for workplaces that are fair to women. And I don't necessarily think that sanitized of all sexuality and fair to women are coextensive. I think that workplaces, especially for poor working women, are horrible for women, are
Mm.
in terms of allowing them to live full and happy lives without stress. And that may or may not have to do with sexual remarks. So, I think that sexual remarks can be a piece of ways in which women suffer in the workplace, but I think it's only a piece. And to the extent that Me Too sheds a light on all the ways in which gender and class and race and economic marginality interact to make real people in the real world suffer, I think that's a great thing. Now, where I think Me Too becomes, like you say, maybe just a political force and talking points, and now just part of everybody, especially Republicans' opposition research, is in this thing that happens when we talk about sex and sexual abuse. It, for feminist, moralistic, historical reasons, becomes the number one factor. And all sexual abuse is collapsed into the worst thing ever. We can't have any other perspective on it than horrific, 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 the worst, the worst, the worst. And that sort of creates this situation where people, as rational actors, tend to calculate lots of different things when they make their political decisions, one of which may be a person's history. And maybe that history includes bad behavior, criminal behavior. But maybe we believe that the person has moved on, that they've changed, and we can keep that in some perspective. Me Too says we cannot. Me Too, at least one of the message that's filtered out is it doesn't matter how old, it doesn't matter, how little evidence there is. It doesn't matter if the person's changed. If there's sexual misconduct going on, cancel them. And I don't think we think about that in terms of other misconduct or other political positions that people used to have that may have been really bad, but they've changed. When we make our political decisions, we weigh things, and we weigh things like critical actors. And I think part of Me Too asked us to be a little less critical about sexual assault. And I think that's, not the way people always operate. That doesn't mean we should say, oh, we don't believe any sexual assault. It means that at some level you have to say, okay, we do believe victims. We don't believe all women are liars. And we do believe that sexual misconduct is serious. But we can still distinguish amongst allegations that seem more and less credible. We can still distinguish amongst conduct that seems more and less serious. We can distinguish between incidents where the person may have done it a long, long time ago and have changed. We can make all those distinctions because we are rational in the way we think about these things. And it doesn't mean we're sexist, right? There's a difference between being sexist and saying, I'm not going to embrace the most unyielding and carceral parts of Me Too.
Mm. Mm. And so, obviously the struggle for equality, ending gendered violence is one that has a long history, and is one that it continues and is obviously far from over. In closing, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you see as the path forward here from our current stance. I mean, if you could offer a suggestion as to what advocates might want to think about, moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's been so much change over the past few years that it's really incredible to me that people are really going beyond saying lowest level people who possess marijuana should not be prosecuted to saying we need to rethink the entire set of assumptions that are driving the carceral model of dealing with social problems. And so what we see is a really growing anti-prison and anti-policing movement, even a prison abolition movement. You see people really concentrating on what are the ways that we can prevent violence against the most vulnerable women in the first place without making it the case that we make more people of color vulnerable to being caged by the police and prosecutors and the government. And I think that there are opportunities for feminists with a lot of experience in sexual violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and domestic violence to take part in these alternate paths towards preventing violence against women. And we see it happening a lot with movements like Incite, other on the ground policing abolition movements, alternative to incarceration movements, restorative justice movements. We see people who really before would have put their energy into making sure that police arrest more often, making sure that prosecutors bring more cases, changing evidence rules to ensure that more convictions happen, to putting their energies more towards how to solve these social problems of women's inequality, poor people's inequality, people of color's inequality, without calling upon the carceral state. So this is already happening. And in my book, I just highlight some of these organizations. And I also highlight a way of thinking about feminism that I call neo-feminism, to be able to retain this feeling that you are a feminist. You are a person who believes that there is unique discrimination on the basis of gender, and it doesn't just all fold into race and class and socioeconomics, but you can be that feminist without necessarily embracing all the orthodoxies, including, blaming individual men, thinking of policing as the solution. You can be a feminist without embracing all of that.
Mm. Well, I, again, thank you so much for coming on the show, and the book, again, I can't say enough good about it, but again, thank you so much for coming on and for this conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Guy. I really enjoyed it, and talking about some of the current topics of the day.
All right, thank you.
Walking the walls of this small room, wondering how you're gonna get out. Small room, you're facing the walls of this small room. How you ever get out? You're walking the walls of this small room, you're facing the walls of this small room. How you ever gonna get out? How you ever gonna get out? You're walking the walls of this small room, facing the walls, wondering if you're ever gonna get out.